Hello, good evening. You're with me, your favorite anchor, Pierre and Nadia for Fokus Minggu Depan. Well, it's a bit interesting today because evidently we are not in the studio at the moment. We are far away from Bukit Jalil. We're currently at the UNICEF Malaysia Contra office. But that's not the whole point of today's segment. We're actually focusing on a humanitarian crisis, specifically about the earthquake that struck Myanmar, and it has been a month ever since the tragedy happened. You know, with hundreds of lives lost and thousands displaced, definitely it has affected many children and also the vulnerable communities. But also, you know, to help us understand better what's happening on the ground, I do want to understand from the UNICEF standpoint what has been done. You know, it has been a month, and what can be done after this. And I believe we are joined by the Regional Chief of Advocacy and Communications at UNICEF, Elian Luthi, here with us in the room with us. Elian, thank you so much for making the time to be with us, Astro AWANI. Now, let's just start where things stand now. Maybe you can share with us, what is the current UNICEF's current assessment of the situations on the ground, particularly for the children and also the vulnerable communities? We both know that it has been a month since the tragedy has happened, so maybe you can share.
I think the first thing that needs to be said is that this is very much a crisis for children, and it's a crisis that is not over. Since the 28th of March, there have been more than 150 aftershocks that have rippled through the very same communities that were struck by the devastating earthquake on the 28th of March. As of today, there are still tens, hundreds of thousands of children that are affected, many of them sleeping outside, sleeping on temple grounds, sleeping in parks and makeshift shelters. And many of these children have lost their caregivers and their parents. And many of them have seen their beloved homes and schools collapse. So, you know, the trauma and the anxiety is really, really immense. There are 2 million children who are currently in need of humanitarian assistance in the earthquake-affected areas. So for children in Myanmar, this is really a crisis on top of an existing crisis of displacement, of insecurity, and of humanitarian needs. So it is a crisis on top of a crisis, and it's a crisis that is not over yet.
Okay, so how are you addressing the unique needs of children in this disaster zones like this?
The biggest risk on the ground right now for children is disease outbreak. Water systems have been broken, health centers and hospitals have been damaged, latrines have been destroyed, and we already are having reports of cases of acute watery diarrhea, which can be deadly for children. There are cases of malaria and dengue fever because mosquitoes are breeding in this unsafe water. So there are significant health risks for children. All of those diseases can be deadly for children. So we have been bringing in safe drinking water for children and families, trucking that in directly to the families that need it. And we've also been bringing in water purification, essential hygiene supplies. So that's one of the major risks right now, is really the disease outbreak side of things. We've also been supporting mobile health clinics because these health centers and hospitals have been damaged. Families really need health care to come to them. So really making sure that medics and nurses are able to directly go to families and bring them the health care that they really need. And then the last challenge for children is a child protection challenge. So when children lose their parents and caregivers, children are dependent on their parents for safety, they're dependent on their parents for food, they're dependent on their parents for education. So when they're separated from their caregivers, or when they've lost their caregivers, it really puts children at huge risk of exploitation, risk of abuse, not able to access essential services. So one of the priorities really is family reunification, making sure that children can find family members and again, be in that safe space of having loving family members that can support them and protect them.
And how is it going so far? You know, the strategy and the planning so far?
It is one of the most complex humanitarian operations. That's for 3 reasons. One is that a sheer logistical challenge. After the earthquake, roads were destroyed, bridges collapsed, telecom towers were down, airports were closed. So very, very difficult to bring in humanitarian supplies to families that need it. The second reason that it's a challenging operation is because Myanmar was a country already in conflict. So that instability, the insecurity, which of course poses huge risks for children, but also for humanitarian operations. So we very much welcome the announcement of ceasefire, the efforts towards a ceasefire in this context. We really need that safe guarantee of access so that our teams can bring in that humanitarian aid. And the third complicating factor is that the monsoon came early. You would have seen those images of those really strong rains and winds that have been sweeping away tents and makeshift shelters, that have been, water has been sort of pouring into those damaged buildings and damaging them even further. So that's really a trifecta of complicating factors for humanitarian operations. But we're lucky to have been in Myanmar for so long. In fact, we've been in Myanmar for 70 years already. We have offices across the country. We have warehouses across the country that were already stocked with life-saving supplies. So we were able, in the early days after the earthquake, to really start moving those supplies towards the families and children that need them. We were also the first humanitarian organization to fly in supplies from abroad, from our global supply hub in Copenhagen. We flew in medical supplies, medical equipment, tents, and so on. So it's really thanks to that preparedness and all those efforts we had made ahead of time that we were able to respond. But it is a very complex humanitarian operation. We're working closely with a lot of the other partners on the ground to be able to reach families.
Oh, that's a very interesting point where you mentioned about you're also working with other local partners. So how is UNICEF coordinating with NGOs and the UN system to ensure there is an efficient and equitable distribution of aid on ground?
Our work is always based on where the needs are. So when an emergency breaks out anywhere in the world, we do what's called a rapid needs assessment. We find out what are the biggest needs, where those needs are, and then we adjust our supply plans and our operations accordingly. So we know that in the case of this earthquake, one of the biggest needs in the beginning was shelter, and that's still an existing need today. The other major needs were clean drinking water, hygiene supplies, medical supplies. So all of that is based on a needs assessment, and we really go where those needs are and where the families need us the most with our partners on the ground. Again, we have a network of partners across the country. This is a country where we already had significant humanitarian response. So we have a network of trusted partners, local NGOs, civil society that we work with, and we really leaned into that network to be able to activate those routes quickly and to get to families that need us.
Awesome. And we've talked about, you've mentioned about how children are very much prone to being traumatized due to this tragedy. So from an advocacy and communication standpoint, how do you ensure that these children know that their voices are being heard in the recovery and also the rebuilding process? Because it's getting struck by an earthquake is it's not easy, it's traumatizing. So how do you ensure that?
I'm very glad you brought up the mental health dimension because this is taking an immense toll on children. It's not just that they have watched their schools collapse, they've watched their homes collapse, they've lost loved ones. They're living with fear and anxiety. And parents have been telling us that children are waking up at night, they're afraid of the dark, they're having nightmares, they're reaching out for their parents and caregivers. Some of them are also experiencing difficulties expressing themselves. So we're having stories of children sitting in front of their broken homes, quiet, silent, unable to express what they've been through, and to even ask for help. So the mental health toll is immense. And we've been setting up child-friendly spaces in earthquake-affected areas. So these are safe spaces where children can go to play, interact with other children, interact with social workers, and really get that support they need to start rebuilding their childhood and build that sense of normalcy. And the other thing that we're really looking at strongly now is education. We know that 2,600 schools were damaged during the earthquake. And sometimes we forget it, but schools are a child's second home. It's part of their daily routine. It's where they meet their friends. It's that playful side of childhood that they're missing out on. So we're also bringing in learning supplies and finding ways to really make sure children can continue learning even in the earthquake-affected areas, even when they're displaced, even if they have teachers that are displaced, there are ways to help them continue their learning, and that's really critical for children. But then we also need to be hearing children's stories. 1/3 of the people that live in Myanmar are children, and often we don't hear their voices enough. So we've really been, our communications and advocacy team in Myanmar has been in there interviewing children, hearing their stories, helping to tell those stories. And these are stories of heartbreak. It's really children who are already living through a crisis. They're now living through another one. So the recovery efforts will take a very long time, and they need to be built around what children need, what they're telling us, and the needs that they're expressing to us.
All right, and we have 3 more minutes left, but before we take our break, maybe one question. What happens, it's also very interesting to see what happens if global attention fades. What if, people just look at this as another forgotten tragedy? Oh, it's just an earthquake. What do you say about it?
Yeah, Myanmar was already a forgotten crisis before the earthquake hit. And if there's one silver lining, it's that the world's attention did go back to Myanmar temporarily. And unfortunately, as you say, that attention is now turning away. There's so many other global crises. There's so many needs in the world right now. But we saw this sort of outpouring of support. And we saw many countries, we saw a lot of support coming from Malaysia as well, people donating to the cause and wanting to support the cause. That was so uplifting and heartening. But our appeal for Myanmar, it's $314 million. And so far, we're 10% funded. So it's great to see that support, but we really need to look at how do we sustain that support? How do we make sure that not just family in the earthquake affected areas, but really families across the country are getting the support that they need? Because again, before this earthquake hit, there were already 6 million children in Myanmar that needed humanitarian assistance. These are children that are displaced. They're missing out on life-saving vaccines. They're out of school. They really need our support. So if there's any silver lining, it's the one of having the world's attention being brought back to Myanmar. And we really hope that that attention continues and that support will continue as well.
All right, that's awesome, Ilian. Thank you so much for the explanations. It actually gives us, a clearer view of the scale and the strategy of the humanitarian response by the UNICEF itself. But beyond plans and logistics, the human cost is completely immeasurable, especially the younger survivors. But don't worry, we'll hear more of these conversations right after our break. We'll be right back. Alright, you're back with me, Pierre and Nadia, for Fokus Minggu Depan. Well, just now before our break, we spoke about the strategy and plans that have been considered by UNICEF. Now we want to let's now turn to the impact itself. 1 month after the disaster, Ilian, what are the conditions like for the children and the families in Myanmar at the moment?
Yeah, as I said, a lot of children and families are still living out in the open. They're still exposed to the rains. The monsoon rains came early this year. They're exposed to rain. They're exposed to heat. Temperatures in Mandalay are going up to 40 degrees. They're exposed to mosquitoes. So there's all these immediate risks that are still out there for these displaced families. And then there's a long-term recovery and rebuilding efforts. So when we look down the road, a few months from now, even a year from now, what we really want to be doing is rebuilding in a way that is more resilient and that is more climate smart. Myanmar is a country that is already extremely fragile because of the humanitarian situation, because of the ongoing conflict, but it's also a country that has been repeatedly exposed to climate shocks. Last year, Typhoon Yagi swept through the country. We remember Cyclone Nargis a few years back, Cyclone Mocha. These were all massive disasters that swept through the country. And when a country is already fragile because of ongoing conflict, displacement, instability, you add on top of that natural disasters, we see exactly what happened with this earthquake. Mass displacement, disease outbreaks, children cut off from essential services like schools and healthcare centers. So we really need to look at, as we rebuild, how do we rebuild better? How do we make this infrastructure more resilient, be able to withstand these recurrent climate shocks and natural disasters that the country is facing?
Well, it's been a month. What is the UNICEF current short and long-term priorities to rebuild the efforts in Myanmar? Because if you spoke quite lengthy explanations you did right there. What's next? So when an emergency breaks out, the first priority is always to bring in life-saving supplies. They're very essential basic needs that families need right away: shelter, water, food, medicine. These are immediate basic needs.
it's been 1 month, and now we're looking at issues of rebuilding. So there's an infrastructure side of things, but then there's also a human side of things, right? The human recovery, and that has to do with things like mental health support. It has to do with things like making sure that we have child psychologists, social workers that are trained, that are able to support children in their recovery. We have to look at the issue of social services in general, right? Do we have the healthcare professionals that are there? That are able to give a long-term support for primary health care? Are teachers available and well-trained to be able to teach in the situation? So again, we will be looking at temporary solutions such as temporary learning centers as a short-term measure, but then we need to look at really how do we get children back into learning over the long term? And again, let's not forget, this is a layer of crisis on top of another crisis. So before this earthquake broke out, millions of children were already out of school. Millions of children were already missing out on life-saving vaccines. Over 1 million children displaced. So these are layers of crisis that we have to look at. So there need to be temporary solutions, but then there also needs to be a long-term vision for rebuilding, again, in a resilient, climate-smart way.
How long do you think this will take, the rebuilding process?
There is the sheer infrastructure rebuilding side of things. There's a lot of rubble that needs to be cleared out, and then things need to be rebuilt, again, in a better way. We need support to do that, right? And it's not UNICEF alone. We don't rebuild schools. We do that with the help of partners to make sure that these systems are up and running again. But it also requires for there to be stability and security in the country. So there's a lot of factors that will influence it. But when we look at the softer side of things, how long does it take for children to recover for something as traumatic as this? You know, there were children that were out playing with their friends in a playground when the earthquake struck. There were children that were in preschool. There were children that were having lunch with their families when this struck. The psychological trauma, when it's with a young child, is immense and will take a long time to recover from. So we really need to focus on that, really focus on the human side of things and the human side of recovery.
Well, we are also speaking in terms of the numbers of, you know, numbers of children being affected. We are expecting more coming in? Are we expecting the numbers to increase?
The aftershocks are continuing. They're not at the level, thankfully, of the devastating earthquake on the 28th of March, which is a 7.7 magnitude earthquake. That said, again, we're looking at communities that have suffered mass displacement, that are living in very, very fragile conditions. So should there be another natural disaster now, it would be absolutely devastating. So the priority does need to be finding those temporary solutions, but then looking at stronger long-term solutions so that children are able to go to sleep in a house that they feel safe in, that they're able to go to school in the morning, be able to complete their school day. I mean, our vision is really for every child in Myanmar to be able to wake up in the morning, to be well-nourished, to be able to get health care they need if they're sick, to be able to go to school every day. These are very simple things. They're not a privilege. These are rights for every child. And so we need to look beyond just the earthquake-affected areas, but every child in Myanmar has that right. And we really need to work towards that. We need to work towards seeing how we support every child to have that very basic childhood that every child has the right to.
Okay, Eliane, before we wrapped up, that's a very wonderful insight that you have shared. Before we wrap up, what can the people here in Malaysia do? You know, whether it's donating, spreading awareness, or supporting in other ways. What is your advice on this?
Yeah. I think there are two things that can be done. One is to donate, right? Through UNICEF Malaysia, you can make a donation still. We still very much need that support, and every dollar counts, every ringgit counts towards the cause. So that's one thing people can do. But then sharing those stories, because Myanmar has fallen out of the headlines. And we need to really sustain that level of attention because, again, this is a crisis that is not over. Yes, the first dramatic days where there was a lot of videos, a lot of news coverage, those days are over, but the needs are still immense. 2 million children are in need of humanitarian assistance just in the earthquake-affected areas. And so we need to really keep telling those children's stories. And, through UNICEF platforms, we've been sharing the stories of children, what their lived realities have been, children that have lost everything and that really need support. So sharing those stories and making sure people are aware of what's happening there and aware that support really needs to be sustained.
Which is basically what you're trying to say is to keep the conversation going, or else it will be completely forgotten, just like everything else.
Another forgotten crisis.
Yeah.
Another forgotten crisis.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Elian, for the insight and for reminding us as to why staying engaged actually matters. And once again, thank you to Elian Luthi and to all the frontline workers doing vital work in silence. I'm Pierre Nadia, and this has been Fokus Minggu Depan. Stay safe and stay informed. Bye-bye.